The silence was deafening, but not in the way most people understand silence. In the sprawling penthouse overlooking downtown Chicago, 7-year-old Michael Chen lived in a world where sound had never existed. Born profoundly deaf to one of the city's most prominent real estate moguls, Michael navigated his days through vibrations, visual cues, and the language of touch that most hearing people never bother to learn. His father, David Chen, had built an empire worth over $200 million, transforming vacant lots into luxury developments across 3 states. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Chen name appeared on billboards, in newspaper headlines, and whispered in boardrooms where million-dollar deals were struck with handshakes. David's days began at 5 in the morning with conference calls to investors in Tokyo and ended past midnight reviewing blueprints for his next ambitious project. Success had become his oxygen, and he breathed it in with every signed contract and every new property acquisition. The diagnosis had come when Michael was 18 months old. David remembered that day with crystalline clarity, sitting in the pediatric audiologist's office as Dr. Martinez explained that their son would never hear a single word, never respond to his name being called, never experience music the way others did. David's first instinct had been to fix it, the same way he approached every challenge in business. He researched the most expensive hearing aids, consulted with specialists in Switzerland, and even looked into experimental surgical procedures that promised miraculous results. But some things cannot be purchased, no matter how deep one's pockets run. Michael's deafness was complete and permanent. The hearing aids amplified nothing because there was nothing to amplify. The surgery consultations ended with gentle but firm rejections from surgeons who explained that Michael's auditory nerves were simply absent. It was a reality that David struggled to accept, even as the years passed and Michael grew from a toddler into a bright, curious child whose eyes held an intelligence that spoke volumes without making a sound. David's response to his son's condition was both generous and misguided. He enrolled Michael in the most prestigious private school for deaf children, one that cost more per year than most families earned in a decade. He hired a parade of specialists, therapists, and tutors who came and went like expensive consultants, each promising to unlock some potential in Michael that would somehow make the deafness less significant. The boy's bedroom resembled a high-tech laboratory, filled with visual learning devices, vibrating alarm clocks, and communication tablets that cost thousands of dollars each. Yet for all the money David poured into his son's education and care, he never learned to sign. Not a single word. When Michael tried to communicate with him using the American Sign Language he was learning at school, David would nod politely and then turn to whoever was nearby to translate. It was easier to hire interpreters for family dinners than to invest the time in learning the language his own son spoke. David justified this distance with the logic that had served him well in business. He was providing for Michael in ways most parents could never dream of. The boy had everything he could possibly need or want. The finest education, the latest technology, a trust fund that would secure his future long after David was gone. Love, David reasoned, was demonstrated through provision. He was showing his love through his bank account, through his endless work to ensure Michael would never want for anything material. The penthouse itself reflected this philosophy. Michael's wing of the apartment was a wonderland, designed specifically for a deaf child. LED lights throughout his rooms could be programmed to flash in different patterns to signal meal times, bedtime, or when someone was looking for him. His bathroom had a waterproof tablet mounted near the shower so he could watch educational videos while getting ready for school. His bedroom featured a projection system that could display constellation maps on the ceiling or immersive nature documentaries on the walls. But despite all these expensive accommodations, Michael spent most of his time in the kitchen with Rosa Martinez, the housekeeper who had been with the Chen family since before Michael was born. Rosa was a 43-year-old woman from Guatemala who had come to Chicago 15 years earlier with nothing but determination and a fierce capacity for love. She had worked for wealthy families before, but never had she encountered a child who moved her heart the way Michael did. Rosa had been there the day Michael came home from the hospital as an infant. She had been the one to notice, months before the official diagnosis, that the baby didn't startle at loud noises or turn toward sounds. She had been present for every doctor's appointment, every specialist consultation, and every heartbreaking explanation about Michael's condition. While David processed the news through spreadsheets and financial planning, Rosa processed it through her heart. The first time Michael had tried to communicate with her using basic signs he learned at school, Rosa felt something shift inside her chest. The boy, then only 4 years old, had carefully formed the sign for water, with his small hands, his dark eyes hopeful and patient as he waited for her to understand. Rosa didn't know sign language, but she recognized the gesture as intentional communication. She had pointed to the kitchen sink, and Michael's face had erupted in the most beautiful smile she had ever seen. That evening, after David had left for another business dinner, and Michael was asleep, Rosa sat at her small kitchen table in her apartment and opened her laptop. She typed "Learn Sign Language" into the search bar and spent the next 3 hours researching classes, books, and online tutorials. By midnight, she had enrolled in a beginner's ASL course at the community college 20 minutes from her home. The classes met twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday evenings from 7 to 9. Rosa had never been a strong student in traditional academic settings, but she approached learning sign language with the dedication of someone whose heart depended on it. She practiced finger spelling during her lunch breaks, watching her reflection in the kitchen window as she formed each letter with increasing precision. She studied vocabulary flashcards while riding the bus to and from work, her fingers constantly moving as she rehearsed new signs. Her instructor, Professor Williams, was a deaf woman in her 50s who had been teaching ASL for over 20 years. She recognized immediately that Rosa was not learning for casual interest or career advancement. There was an urgency in Rosa's questions, a tenderness in the way she asked about communicating with children, that spoke of deeper motivation. When Rosa explained about Michael during the 3rd week of class, Professor Williams offered to provide additional materials, specifically focused on communicating with deaf children. Learning sign language was unlike anything Rosa had experienced before. It required her to think visually, to use her hands and facial expressions as instruments of communication in ways that felt foreign at first. The grammar was different from both English and Spanish, following its own logical structure that took weeks to begin feeling natural. But Rosa persevered, driven by the memory of Michael's patient eyes waiting for understanding. After 6 weeks of classes, Rosa felt confident enough to try basic communication with Michael. She had been practicing the sign for good morning until her fingers could form it without conscious thought. That Tuesday morning, when Michael came downstairs for breakfast, Rosa faced him directly, made sure she had his attention, and carefully signed "Good morning" while speaking the words aloud. Michael's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. His eyes widened with surprise and delight, and he signed back "Good morning" before launching into a rapid series of signs that Rosa couldn't yet understand. But his excitement was unmistakable. He ran to her and wrapped his arms around her waist, his small body trembling with joy. For the first time in his 7 years, an adult in his daily life was speaking his language. David noticed the change in Michael immediately, though he didn't understand its source. The boy seemed more animated at breakfast, more eager to interact with Rosa. Michael kept looking between Rosa and his father with an expression David couldn't quite interpret. It was only when Rosa began consistently using sign language during their interactions that David realized what was happening. His initial reaction was complicated. He felt a flash of something that might have been jealousy, watching his son communicate so naturally with the housekeeper while still requiring interpreters to talk with his own father. But this feeling was quickly overshadowed by relief. If Rosa could communicate with Michael, it would make David's life easier. He wouldn't need to worry about miscommunications or Michael's needs going unmet during the long hours when David was at the office. David never asked Rosa about her sign language lessons or expressed any curiosity about how she had learned to communicate with Michael. In his mind, this was simply another example of good help being worth the investment. Rosa was earning her salary by adapting to Michael's needs, just as any good employee would adapt to their job requirements. But Rosa's motivation went far beyond professional duty. Each new sign she learned felt like a bridge being built between her heart and Michael's world. As her vocabulary expanded, their conversations grew richer and more complex. She learned to sign about feelings, about dreams, about the stories Michael created in his imagination. She discovered that Michael was not just intelligent, but profoundly creative, crafting elaborate tales about space adventures and underwater kingdoms that he shared with animated gestures and expressions. Michael began teaching Rosa signs he had learned at school, delighting in their role reversal where he became the teacher and she the eager student. He showed her the proper handshakes for complex concepts, giggling when she made mistakes and patiently correcting her finger positions.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Their relationship deepened beyond caregiver and child into something approaching true friendship, built on mutual respect and genuine communication. The transformation in Michael's daily experience was remarkable. Instead of existing in relative isolation within his own home, he now had someone who could understand his thoughts, his jokes, his questions, and his concerns. When he woke up from a nightmare, Rosa could ask him about it in sign language and help him process his fears. When he was excited about something he had learned at school, he could share his enthusiasm without waiting for an interpreter to be present. Rosa began incorporating sign language into all aspects of Michael's home routine. She signed while she cooked, explaining each step of meal preparation and teaching him kitchen-related vocabulary. She signed while they did laundry together, turning the mundane household task into an opportunity for language practice. She signed while they watched television, providing running commentary and explanation for shows that weren't captioned. Most importantly, Rosa signed about emotions. She helped Michael identify and express feelings that he had previously kept locked inside. When he was frustrated about something at school, Rosa would sit with him at the kitchen table and let him sign out his anger, validating his feelings and helping him work through solutions. When he was happy about a good grade or a successful interaction with classmates, Rosa celebrated with him, her hands moving in enthusiastic praise that matched the joy in her expression. The kitchen became their sanctuary, a place where communication flowed freely and naturally. Rosa would prepare Michael's favorite snacks while he sat at the breakfast bar, telling her about his day through gestures and expressions that grew more sophisticated each week. She learned his sense of humor, discovering that he had a particular fondness for visual puns and wordplay that could only exist in sign language. Michael's relationship with his father remained largely unchanged. David continued to interact with his son primarily through intermediaries, whether interpreters, teachers, or Rosa herself. He attended Michael's school performances and parent-teacher conferences, but these interactions felt formal and distant. David would nod approvingly when teachers praised Michael's progress, but he never engaged directly with his son about these achievements. The disconnect became most apparent during family dinners, which happened perhaps once a week when David's schedule allowed. These meals were exercises in polite silence, with David focusing on his food and his phone, while Michael and Rosa carried on animated conversations in sign language. Occasionally, David would ask Rosa to translate something Michael had said, but more often he seemed content to let their communication exist in a world he didn't need to enter. David's friends and business associates often commented on how well he was handling Michael's disability. They praised his dedication to providing the best possible resources for his son, and David accepted these compliments as validation of his parenting approach. He genuinely believed that ensuring Michael's financial security and educational opportunities was the most loving thing he could do. But Michael was beginning to understand something that his father had not yet grasped. Love was not just about provision and protection. Love was about presence, about attention, about the willingness to enter someone else's world and learn their language. At 7 years old, Michael was developing a sophisticated understanding of relationships that went far beyond his years. He noticed how Rosa's face lit up when he entered the kitchen each morning. He saw how she leaned forward when he was telling her something important, how she remembered details from conversations they had days earlier, how she created special signs just for their inside jokes. He felt the warmth in her touch when she hugged him goodnight, the patience in her corrections when he made signing mistakes, the genuine interest she showed in his thoughts and feelings. In contrast, Michael observed his father's polite distance, the way David's eyes often focused on something beyond Michael even when they were in the same room. He noticed how his father's hugs felt obligatory, how their interactions required preparation and translation, how David seemed more comfortable discussing Michael than talking with him. Michael began to form a complex understanding of his place in his father's life. He knew David loved him in some abstract way, but he also sensed that his deafness created a barrier that his father was unwilling or unable to cross. The expensive gifts and elaborate accommodations felt less like expressions of love and more like attempts to solve a problem that David found inconvenient. Rosa, meanwhile, had become fluent enough in sign language to handle complex conversations. She could discuss Michael's homework, his friendships at school, his dreams for the future, and his questions about why he was different from other children. She had learned to read his moods through subtle changes in his posture and expression, understanding when he needed space and when he needed comfort. Their bond was built on small moments that accumulated into something profound. Rosa teaching Michael to bake cookies while signing the measurements and instructions. Michael helping Rosa practice new vocabulary by acting out different scenarios they might encounter. Late afternoon conversations on the balcony where Michael would describe the shapes he saw in the clouds and Rosa would add her own interpretations to his imaginative stories. These moments were creating a foundation of trust and understanding that would soon be tested in ways neither of them could anticipate. Michael was growing more aware of the differences between his relationships with the two adults who shaped his daily life, and this awareness was beginning to create questions that would demand answers. The contrast became most stark during Michael's 8th birthday celebration. David had planned an elaborate party with a magician who specialized in visual entertainment for deaf audiences, elaborate cake shaped like Michael's favorite video game character, and gifts that filled an entire corner of the living room. The guest list included Michael's classmates and their parents, David's business associates who had children, and various family friends who had known Michael since birth. Throughout the party, David played the role of devoted father with practiced ease. He smiled for photos, thanked guests for coming, and made sure every detail of the celebration was perfect. But when Michael tried to show him a magic trick he had learned at school, David nodded appreciatively without really watching, his attention already shifting to conversations with other adults about business opportunities and market trends. Rosa spent the party ensuring that Michael felt included in every moment. She interpreted conversations between Michael and his hearing friends, helped him understand the magician's patter, and made sure he was the center of attention during gift opening and cake cutting. She signed enthusiastic commentary about each present, shared in his excitement over surprises, and made sure his responses were communicated to guests who didn't sign. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Michael found himself standing between two very different expressions of care. David was already discussing cleanup logistics with the catering staff and planning his schedule for the following week. Rosa was at his side, asking in sign language if he had enjoyed his special day and if there was anything else he wanted to do before bedtime. That night, as Rosa tucked Michael into bed, he signed a question that revealed how much he had been thinking about relationships and love. He asked why his father never learned to talk with his hands the way Rosa had. Rosa felt her heart constrict at the innocence and honesty of the question. She explained gently that different people show love in different ways, that his father worked very hard to make sure Michael had everything he needed. But Michael's next question cut even deeper into the complexity of their situation. He asked Rosa if she thought his father would love him more if he could hear. The question hung in the air between them, too profound and painful for easy answers. Rosa gathered Michael into her arms and signed that she was absolutely certain his father loved him exactly as he was, but even as she formed the reassuring words with her hands, she wondered if she was telling the truth. The months following Michael's birthday marked a period of growing awareness for the young boy. He was becoming more observant of social dynamics, more conscious of the different ways people related to him, and more curious about concepts like family, love, and belonging. His questions to Rosa became more sophisticated, touching on themes that required careful and thoughtful responses. Michael began asking about Rosa's life outside of their home. Where did she live? Did she have a family of her own? What did she do when she wasn't taking care of him? Rosa found herself sharing stories about her small apartment across town, her weekly phone calls with her mother in Guatemala, her evening sign language classes where she continued to advance her skills, and her quiet Sunday mornings when she would sit in her favorite coffee shop and practice fingerspelling while reading the newspaper. These conversations revealed to Michael that Rosa had chosen to learn his language, had made sacrifices of her own time and energy to communicate with him, had no obligation beyond her job duties to care about his thoughts and feelings. The realization that Rosa's attention was a gift rather than a requirement began to shift something fundamental in Michael's understanding of relationships. At the same time, Michael was becoming more aware of his father's schedule and priorities. He noticed how David's face changed when business calls interrupted family time, how his father's energy seemed to be reserved for work-related activities, how conversations about Michael's school and achievements were often brief and superficial. Michael began to understand that while David provided for him financially, Rosa was providing something entirely different and arguably more valuable. The school year was progressing well for Michael academically and socially. His teachers reported that his reading and writing skills were advancing rapidly, and he had formed close friendships with several classmates who appreciated his creativity and humor. But his teachers also noticed that when they asked about his family, Michael talked primarily about Rosa rather than his father. During family tree projects and show-and-tell presentations about important people in his life, Rosa figured prominently while David was mentioned only in passing. This pattern did not go unnoticed by Michael's teacher, Mrs. Peterson, who had been working with deaf children for over 15 years. She had seen many family dynamics over the years and understood the challenges that hearing parents often faced in connecting with deaf children. But she was concerned about the emotional distance she sensed between Michael and his father, particularly as Michael entered a developmental stage where his understanding of family relationships was becoming more complex. Mrs. Peterson scheduled a conference with David to discuss Michael's progress, but her real agenda was to address what she saw as a growing emotional gap in Michael's home life.
She carefully presented her observations about Michael's academic and social development, praising his intelligence and adaptability, while gently introducing her concerns about family communication. David attended the conference with his typical business-focused mindset, treating it as another appointment to be efficiently completed. He listened to Mrs. Peterson's academic report with satisfaction, pleased to hear that his investment in Michael's education was producing measurable results. But when the teacher began discussing communication patterns at home, David's attention became more guarded. Mrs. Peterson explained that Michael spoke frequently about Rosa, but rarely mentioned activities or conversations with his father. She shared her observation that Michael seemed to have formed his primary emotional attachment with his caregiver rather than his parent, and she gently suggested that this pattern might have long-term implications for their relationship. She emphasized that this was not unusual in families where communication barriers existed, but that it was also not inevitable.
David's response revealed both his defensive instincts and his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. He explained to Mrs. Peterson how much he had invested in Michael's care, listing the expensive treatments, educational opportunities, and technological resources he had provided. He mentioned Rosa's sign language skills as another example of the excellent care he had arranged for his son. He seemed to view the strong relationship between Michael and Rosa as evidence of his good judgment in hiring quality help, rather than as a potential indicator of his own emotional absence. Mrs. Peterson realized that David was not yet ready to hear her deeper message about the importance of direct parent-child communication. She ended the conference by providing some resources about family communication strategies and suggesting that David might consider learning basic sign language to enhance his relationship with Michael. David accepted the materials politely, but without any apparent intention of acting on the suggestions. That evening, David did something unusual for him. Instead of working late at the office or attending a business dinner, he came home early and found Michael and Rosa in the kitchen, working together on a science project about plant growth. They were so engrossed in their signed conversation about photosynthesis and root systems that they didn't immediately notice his arrival. David stood in the doorway for several minutes, watching his son's animated expressions and Rosa's patient responses. He saw the natural flow of their communication, the way Michael's face lit up when Rosa confirmed his understanding of a concept, the comfortable way they moved around each other in the shared space of the kitchen. For the first time, David truly observed the depth of the relationship that had developed between his son and the housekeeper. What struck David most was Michael's obvious comfort and happiness during this interaction. The boy he saw with Rosa was more expressive, more confident, and more engaged than the polite child who appeared at their formal family dinners. This Michael laughed freely, asked complex questions, and shared his thoughts without hesitation. This was a version of his son that David rarely witnessed, and he began to suspect that this difference had less to do with Michael's personality than with the quality of communication available to him. When Rosa finally noticed David standing there, she began to transition into her more formal household employee mode, asking about dinner preparations and his evening schedule. But Michael's reaction to his father's presence was what stayed with David long into the night. The boy's demeanor shifted subtly but noticeably, becoming more reserved and careful. The natural animation that had characterized his conversation with Rosa dimmed into something more polite and distant. David realized that evening that his son had learned to modulate his behavior based on his audience. With Rosa, Michael was fully himself. With David, Michael was the well-behaved child of a successful businessman, pleasant but not particularly engaged. This recognition was uncomfortable for David, forcing him to acknowledge that his relationship with Michael was more formal than paternal, more transactional than emotional. That night, after Michael was asleep and Rosa had finished her evening duties, David found himself alone in his study with the materials Mrs. Peterson had provided about family communication. For the first time, he seriously considered the possibility that his approach to fatherhood might be missing something essential. The brochures and articles spoke about the importance of shared language, of entering the child's world rather than expecting the child to adapt entirely to the hearing world, of building emotional connection through direct communication rather than through intermediaries. David had always prided himself on solving problems through resources and strategic thinking. He had approached Michael's deafness the same way he approached business challenges, by hiring the best experts and implementing the most expensive solutions. But as he sat in his study that night, surrounded by evidence of his financial success but feeling strangely disconnected from his own son, David began to wonder if some problems required different kinds of solutions. The thought of learning sign language felt daunting to David in ways that had nothing to do with the complexity of the language itself. He was accustomed to being the expert in every room, the person others turned to for knowledge and leadership. The idea of being a beginner, of making mistakes in front of his son, of revealing his ignorance about something so fundamental to Michael's experience, triggered insecurities that David rarely acknowledged. But these materials also spoke to something deeper that David had been avoiding.
They talked about the emotional cost to deaf children when their own parents could not communicate with them directly, about the message that such distance sent about the child's worth and the parents' investment in the relationship. They described the profound joy that families experienced when hearing parents made the effort to learn sign language and the transformative effect this had on parent-child bonds. As David read these accounts of other families' experiences, he began to recognize patterns that felt uncomfortably familiar. Children who formed primary attachments to caregivers or interpreters rather than parents. Parents who provided excellent material care while remaining emotionally distant from their children's inner lives. Families that functioned efficiently but lacked the warmth and intimacy that characterized truly connected relationships. For the first time since Michael's diagnosis 7 years earlier, David began to consider the possibility that his approach to fatherhood had been fundamentally flawed, not in its intentions, which were loving, but in its execution, which had prioritized provision over presence, resources over relationship, solving over connecting. He began to understand that Michael needed more than excellent care and financial security. He needed a father who could talk with him directly, who could understand his thoughts and feelings without translation, who could be present in his world rather than expecting Michael to constantly adapt to the hearing world. This recognition marked the beginning of a slow shift in David's thinking, though he was not yet ready to act on these insights. Change would require him to admit that his previous approach had been insufficient, that despite his best intentions and unlimited resources, he had failed to build the kind of relationship with Michael that both of them deserved. It would require him to become vulnerable, to risk making mistakes, to invest time and energy that could not be delegated to employees or purchased with money. The materials Mrs. Peterson had provided sat on David's desk for several weeks, a constant reminder of the choice he needed to make. He could continue on his current path, providing excellent material care while remaining emotionally distant from his son. Or he could take the more difficult route of learning to communicate directly with Michael, risking his pride and his time but potentially gaining something far more valuable than any business success he had ever achieved. Meanwhile, Michael and Rosa continued to deepen their relationship through daily interactions that were rich with communication, understanding, and genuine affection. Michael was thriving in this environment of acceptance and direct communication, growing more confident in expressing himself and more secure in the knowledge that at least one important adult in his life truly understood him. But Michael was also beginning to ask more pointed questions about family, about love, and about why his father seemed so different from Rosa in his willingness to enter Michael's world. These questions would soon require answers that would force all three of them to confront the reality of their relationships and the choices that had shaped their family dynamic. The foundation was being laid for a confrontation that would change everything, though none of them could yet see the crisis that was approaching. Michael's growing awareness, Rosa's deepening attachment, and David's slow recognition of his emotional distance were creating conditions for a moment of truth that would test all of their assumptions about love, family, and what it means to truly care for another person. The stage was set for a reckoning that would force David to choose between his comfortable distance and his son's emotional needs, that would test Rosa's role in a family that was not technically her own, and that would give Michael a voice in determining what kind of family relationships he wanted and deserved. As winter approached and Michael's 9th birthday drew near, the dynamics in the Chen household were shifting in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. The comfortable arrangements that had sustained their family for years were beginning to show strain, and the question of what Michael truly needed from his father was about to become unavoidable. The next phase of their story would test everything they thought they knew about love, commitment, and the sacrifices that real relationships require. Michael's journey toward understanding his own worth and his father's capacity for change was just beginning, and the lessons they would all learn would transform not just their family, but their fundamental understanding of what it means to truly connect with another human being. Spring arrived in Chicago with its usual promise of renewal, but for David Chen the changing season brought an unexpected reckoning. The quarterly board meeting that had consumed his attention for weeks was finally behind him, but instead of the satisfaction he typically felt after a successful presentation, David found himself preoccupied with thoughts of his son. The conversation with Mrs. Peterson had planted seeds of doubt that refused to stop growing, and watching Michael's easy communication with Rosa had watered those seeds with uncomfortable truths. Michael had recently turned 9, and his birthday celebration had been another exercise in elaborate planning and emotional distance. David had arranged for a private screening of Michael's favorite animated film at a luxury theater, complete with visual effects and vibrating seats that translated the soundtrack into physical sensations. The guest list had included 20 of Michael's classmates and their families, and the party had been deemed a tremendous success by everyone who attended. Yet David couldn't shake the memory of a brief moment during the celebration when Michael had tried to share something with him. The boy had approached his father during the movie, tapping his arm excitedly and pointing at the screen. Michael's hands moved rapidly in what David recognized as sign language, his face animated with whatever observation he was trying to communicate. David had smiled and nodded, patting Michael's shoulder in acknowledgement, but the boy's expression had shifted from excitement to resignation when he realized his father didn't understand. Rosa had been seated nearby and had quickly interpreted Michael's comment about how the visual effects reminded him of a story he was writing in school. By the time the translation reached David, the moment had passed, but the image of Michael's disappointed face lingered in David's mind long after the party ended. It occurred to him that this scene played out regularly in their interactions, with Michael reaching out and David failing to connect, not from lack of love but from lack of language. The decision to finally learn sign language came to David not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something he had been avoiding for too long.
He was in his office on a Tuesday morning, reviewing contracts for a new development project, when he found himself thinking about Michael instead of square footage and profit margins. David realized that he knew intimate details about every property in his portfolio, but couldn't tell anyone what his son was thinking about, what excited him, what worried him, or what made him laugh. David's approach to learning sign language reflected his business mindset. He researched the most efficient methods, identified the highest-rated instructors, and prepared to tackle this challenge with the same systematic approach that had built his empire. He contacted 3 different language learning companies, interviewed potential private tutors, and purchased every recommended textbook and digital resource available. But David also made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of hiring a private instructor to come to his office or home, he enrolled in group classes at the same community college where Rosa had learned to sign. Something about learning alongside other adults who were navigating similar challenges appealed to him, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. Perhaps it was the recognition that this journey required humility rather than the authority he wielded in business settings. The first class was a humbling experience for someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. David sat among a diverse group of students that included parents of deaf children, healthcare workers, teachers, and individuals who were learning sign language for personal relationships. The instructor, Professor Williams, treated all students with the same patient encouragement, but David felt clumsy and self-conscious as he struggled with basic handshakes and finger positions. Learning to finger spell his own name took longer than David had anticipated. His hands, so confident when signing contracts and shaking hands in boardrooms, felt awkward and uncoordinated when forming the letters DAVID. He practiced during lunch breaks, in his car between appointments, and at home in his study after Michael had gone to bed. The muscle memory that came naturally to others seemed to elude him, and he found himself frustrated by progress that felt impossibly slow. But David persisted with the same determination that had carried him through every business challenge he had faced. He attended every class, completed every assignment, and gradually began to feel more comfortable with basic vocabulary and sentence structures. After 6 weeks, he could introduce himself, ask simple questions, and engage in rudimentary conversations about weather, food, and daily activities. The breakthrough came during his 8th week of classes when Professor Williams taught the signs for family relationships. David learned to sign father, son and love with a precision that felt different from the mechanical vocabulary he had been memorizing. These weren't just words to be mastered for academic credit. These were the building blocks of conversations he wanted to have with Michael, the foundation for a relationship he was finally ready to build. David decided to surprise Michael with his newfound skills on a Saturday morning when Rosa had the weekend off. He had been practicing a simple greeting and question, rehearsing the handshakes and facial expressions until they felt somewhat natural. When Michael came downstairs for breakfast, David positioned himself where his son could see him clearly and carefully signed, "Good morning. How did you sleep?" Michael's reaction was immediate and profound. His eyes widened with shock, then filled with tears, and finally exploded into the biggest smile David had ever seen on his son's face. Michael launched himself across the kitchen and into his father's arms with a force that nearly knocked David backward. The boy clung to him with desperate joy, as if afraid that this moment might disappear if he let go. When Michael finally pulled back, his hands moved frantically in response, signing so quickly that David could only catch fragments of what he was trying to communicate. Michael realized his father's limitations and slowed down, carefully signing "You learned my words" with exaggerated movements that David could follow. The simple sentence contained a universe of meaning that hit David with unexpected emotional force. David's response was halting and grammatically imperfect, but heartfelt. He signed, "I want to talk with you," while speaking the words aloud, and Michael's face crumpled with emotion. The boy threw his arms around his father again, and David felt tears on his own cheeks that he didn't remember starting to cry. That morning marked the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship, though it was built on small moments rather than grand gestures. David's sign language skills were elementary, limited to basic conversations about simple topics, but Michael was patient and encouraging in ways that reminded David of Rosa's gentle teaching style. The boy would slow down his signing when David looked confused, repeat words that his father didn't understand, and celebrate every small breakthrough as if it were a major victory. Their first real conversation happened 3 weeks later, when Michael fell while riding his bike in the driveway and scraped his knee badly enough to require first aid. In the past, David would have called for Rosa or simply driven Michael to the emergency room without much discussion. But this time, he sat with his son in the bathroom, carefully cleaning the wound, while attempting to ask in sign language if it hurt very much. Michael's response opened a window into his inner life that David had never glimpsed before. The boy signed not just about the physical pain, but about his embarrassment at falling, his worry that his father would think he was careless, and his appreciation that David was taking care of him personally instead of delegating the task to someone else. The conversation was stilted and required frequent repetition and clarification, but it was theirs in a way that interpreted conversations had never been. David realized that evening that he had learned more about Michael's personality in that 20-minute exchange than he had discovered in years of formal family interactions. His son was thoughtful, self-critical, eager to please, and hungry for direct connection with his father. These insights should have been obvious to any observant parent, but David's emotional distance had prevented him from seeing what was right in front of him. As David's signing improved, their conversations became more frequent and more substantial. Michael began sharing details about his school day, his friendships, his favorite subjects, and his struggles with assignments he found challenging. David learned that his son was fascinated by astronomy and spent hours reading about planets and galaxies. He discovered that Michael had a dry sense of humor and enjoyed wordplay that worked especially well in visual language. Most importantly, David began to understand how isolated Michael had felt within their own home. The boy had learned to entertain himself, to find meaning in solitary activities, and to expect very little emotional engagement from his father. Michael had adapted to their family dynamic with remarkable resilience, but David could see now that this adaptation had come at a significant emotional cost.
The changes in their relationship did not go unnoticed by Rosa, who observed the father and son's growing connection with mixed feelings. She was genuinely happy to see David finally engaging with Michael in meaningful ways, and she could see how much the boy treasured every interaction with his father. Michael would rush to tell Rosa about conversations he'd had with David, his excitement palpable as he recounted each exchange. But Rosa also felt a complicated sadness as she watched David discover aspects of Michael's personality that she had known and cherished for years. She had been the one to encourage Michael's interest in astronomy, spending evenings on the balcony, helping him identify constellations and learn about the solar system. She had been the audience for his jokes, the confidant for his worries, and the steady presence that had shaped his daily experience of love and security. Rosa never expressed these feelings directly, but David was observant enough to notice subtle changes in her demeanor. She seemed more reserved during their interactions, less likely to insert herself into conversations between father and son, and more conscious of her role as an employee rather than a family member. David sensed that his growing relationship with Michael was shifting the household dynamic in ways that affected everyone involved. The situation came to a head on a rainy Thursday evening in late spring, when David arrived home early from work to find Michael and Rosa in the living room, working together on a complex jigsaw puzzle. They were engaged in an animated signed conversation about strategy and pattern recognition, their heads bent close together as they examined pieces and tested different combinations. David stood in the doorway watching them, and for the first time, he felt something approaching jealousy, rather than relief at their closeness. He wanted to be the one sharing Michael's excitement about finding the right piece for a difficult section of the puzzle. He wanted to be the person Michael turned to for help with problem solving and encouragement during frustrating moments. When Michael noticed his father's presence, his face lit up with the enthusiasm that had become typical of their interactions since David had started signing. The boy immediately began explaining the puzzle strategy he and Rosa had developed, his hands moving rapidly as he described their systematic approach to organizing pieces by color and pattern. David joined them on the floor, asking questions about their progress and offering suggestions for areas where they seemed stuck. But as the three of them worked together, David became increasingly aware of the complex dynamics at play. Michael moved easily between communicating with both adults, but his relationship with Rosa had a depth and comfort that David was still working to build. Rosa, meanwhile, seemed to be deliberately stepping back from her usual role as Michael's primary companion, allowing David to take the lead in helping with the puzzle and responding to Michael's questions. Her deference felt appropriate professionally, but emotionally charged personally, as if she were consciously yielding territory that had once been exclusively hers. The evening culminated in a moment that surprised all three of them. When they finally completed the puzzle, Michael threw his arms around both adults in a group hug, signing "I love you both" with tears in his eyes. The simple statement contained layers of complexity that none of them were fully prepared to address. David felt his chest tighten with emotion as he realized that his son's capacity for love had never been the issue. Michael had always been ready to connect with him. It was David who had been unavailable. Rosa's tears were equally complicated, reflecting joy at Michael's happiness, but also uncertainty about her place in this evolving family dynamic. That night, after Michael had gone to bed, David found himself in an unexpected conversation with Rosa about their respective roles in the boy's life. It was the first time they had ever discussed their relationship as anything other than employer and employee, and both of them felt uncertain about the boundaries and expectations that should guide their interaction. Rosa expressed her genuine happiness about David's growing connection with Michael, emphasizing how much the boy had longed for direct communication with his father. But she also shared her concerns about her own place in Michael's life as David became more present and engaged. She had spent years building a relationship with Michael that felt parental in every way except biology, and she wasn't sure how to navigate the changing dynamics. David found himself in the unusual position of reassuring someone else about their importance to his son. He told Rosa that he could see how much Michael loved her, how central she had been to his emotional development, and how grateful David was for the stability and care she had provided during his own absence.
He made it clear that his growing relationship with Michael was not intended to replace what Rosa had given the boy, but to add to it. But even as David spoke these reassuring words, he was grappling with his own complicated feelings about Rosa's role in their family. He appreciated everything she had done for Michael, but he also felt a sense of loss about the years when she had been more of a parent to his son than he had been. He was grateful for her dedication, but he also felt ashamed that it had been necessary. These emotional complications were pushed into the background by a crisis that emerged the following week, when Michael's school called to report that he had been in a fight during lunch. The incident was unusual for Michael, who was typically well-behaved and got along well with his classmates. David left work immediately to pick up his son, using the drive to the school to prepare himself for a conversation that would have been impossible just months earlier. Mrs. Peterson met them in her office with a detailed account of what had happened. Michael had been eating lunch with his usual group of friends when a boy from another class had begun making fun of his deafness, mimicking sign language in a mocking way, and laughing at Michael's attempts to communicate with his friends. Michael had tolerated the teasing for several minutes before finally losing his temper and pushing the other boy, leading to a brief scuffle that teachers had quickly broken up. David listened to this account with growing anger, not at Michael but at the situation his son had been forced to endure. He realized that this was probably not the first time Michael had faced this kind of treatment, and he wondered how many similar incidents had occurred without his knowledge. When Mrs. Peterson asked how David wanted to handle the disciplinary aspects of the situation, he surprised both her and himself by asking to speak with Michael directly about what had happened. The conversation that followed was the most emotionally complex discussion David had ever attempted in sign language. Michael was initially reluctant to discuss the incident, signing brief responses about being sorry for fighting and promising not to do it again. But David persisted, asking gentle questions about what had led to the confrontation and how Michael had felt during the teasing. Gradually, Michael opened up about his experience, describing not just this incident but a pattern of occasional mockery and exclusion that he had been dealing with for months. He signed about feeling different from his classmates, about sometimes wishing he could hear so that interactions would be easier, and about his fear that fighting would disappoint both David and Rosa. David's response drew on every emotion he had been processing since beginning to learn sign language. He signed about being proud of Michael for standing up for himself, about being sorry that adults had not protected him better from this kind of treatment, and about his regret that Michael had faced these challenges without being able to discuss them at home. Most importantly, David told Michael that being deaf was not something to be ashamed of, that sign language was a beautiful and legitimate form of communication, and that anyone who mocked these things was revealing their own ignorance and cruelty. He promised Michael that they would work together to address the bullying situation and that Michael would never have to face such challenges alone. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship, moving beyond basic communication into the realm of emotional support and advocacy that defines true parental connection. Michael cried as David held him, but these were tears of relief rather than shame. For the first time, his father had truly understood his experience and validated his feelings. David followed up the conversation with immediate action, meeting with school administrators to ensure that the bullying situation was addressed appropriately and that Michael felt safe in his learning environment. He also began volunteering for school events and committees, becoming a visible presence in Michael's educational community in ways he had never been before. These changes were noticed by everyone in Michael's world. His teachers saw a boy who seemed more confident and secure, more willing to participate in class discussions and social activities. His friends observed that Michael talked about his father more frequently and with obvious pride. Rosa watched as Michael's relationship with David deepened and became more central to his sense of identity and belonging.
But the most significant change was in Michael himself. The boy who had learned to expect very little emotional engagement from his father was discovering that he could share his thoughts, feelings, and experiences directly with David. This shift was transformative, giving Michael a sense of completeness in his family relationships that he had never experienced before. The summer brought new opportunities for David and Michael to build their relationship through shared activities that had never been possible when communication was limited to basic transactions. They began taking weekend trips together, exploring museums and planetariums that catered to Michael's interest in science and astronomy. David learned to appreciate how much more observant Michael was than hearing children, noticing visual details that others missed and making connections between concepts in ways that reflected his visual learning style. These trips also gave David insight into how Michael navigated the hearing world with remarkable skill and confidence. He watched his son communicate with museum staff through writing and gestures, saw how Michael used technology to enhance his learning experience, and observed the strategies Michael had developed for managing situations where sign language interpretation wasn't available. David began to understand that Michael's deafness, while presenting certain challenges, had also given him unique strengths and perspectives that were valuable and admirable. Instead of viewing his son's condition as a limitation to be overcome, David started seeing it as a different way of experiencing and understanding the world. This shift in perspective was particularly evident during a visit to a planetarium where they attended a special program designed for deaf audiences. David watched Michael's face illuminate as the visual presentation unfolded, saw how completely engaged he was with the scientific concepts being presented, and realized that his son's way of learning was not inferior to hearing approaches but simply different. The program included an opportunity for audience members to ask questions, and Michael raised his hand to share an observation about planetary motion that impressed both the presenter and other attendees. David felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with accommodation or special treatment, and everything to do with his son's genuine intelligence and curiosity. During the drive home, David told Michael how proud he was of his thoughtful question and his obvious knowledge of astronomy. Michael's response revealed how much their relationship had changed over the past several months. He signed that he was glad his father could finally understand how much he loved learning about space and planets, and that he had been wanting to share this passion with David for years. The conversation continued over dinner at a restaurant that David had chosen specifically because it had good lighting for sign language communication. As they ate, Michael shared his dream of someday working for NASA or becoming an astronomer, goals that he had previously discussed only with Rosa. David found himself making genuine commitments to support these aspirations, promising to help Michael find summer programs and mentorship opportunities related to his interests. As they talked, David realized that he was having the kind of conversation with his son that he had always assumed would happen naturally as Michael got older. He had expected that their relationship would deepen automatically over time, without recognizing that communication barriers were preventing the emotional intimacy that makes such conversations possible. The evening ended with Michael signing something that stopped David's heart. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Michael looked directly at his father and signed "Thank you for learning my language." The simple statement contained gratitude, love, and recognition that David had made a choice to enter Michael's world rather than expecting his son to exist entirely in the hearing world. David's response was equally simple but profound. He signed "Thank you for being patient with me," and meant it with every fiber of his being. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it marked the completion of a transformation that had been months in the making. That night, as David reflected on how dramatically his relationship with Michael had changed, he realized that learning sign language had been about much more than acquiring a new skill. It had required him to examine his priorities, to acknowledge his failures as a father, and to make fundamental changes in how he approached parenting and relationships. The man who had once believed that love could be adequately expressed through provision and protection had learned that true connection requires vulnerability, effort, and the willingness to meet another person in their own world. David had discovered that being a father meant more than ensuring his son's material welfare. It meant understanding Michael's inner life and being present for both his joys and his struggles. As summer progressed, David and Michael's relationship continued to deepen, but it also created new challenges for the family dynamic. Rosa found herself in an increasingly complicated position, as the person who had bridged the gap between father and son discovered that the bridge was no longer needed in the same way. Michael still loved Rosa deeply and sought out her company for comfort and conversation, but his primary emotional needs were increasingly being met by David. This shift was natural and healthy, but it was also painful for Rosa, who had to navigate the transition from being Michael's primary attachment figure to being an important but secondary presence in his life. The situation was further complicated by David's growing awareness of how dependent he had been on Rosa, not just for household management, but for emotional labor related to Michael's care. As he took on more responsibility for understanding and responding to his son's needs, David began to appreciate the enormous amount of care and attention Rosa had provided over the years. This appreciation led to awkward conversations about Rosa's role in their family and what changes might be appropriate as David became more present in Michael's life. Neither of them wanted to diminish the relationship between Rosa and Michael, but both recognized that the dynamics were shifting in ways that required careful navigation. The tension came to a head during a family dinner, when Michael, in his innocent desire to include both adults in conversation, asked David and Rosa to tell him their favorite memories of him from when he was younger. The question highlighted the stark difference in their experiences with Michael and forced all of them to confront the reality of the past 8 years. Rosa's memories were rich with detail and emotional significance. She could describe Michael's first successful attempt at riding a bike, the night he had been afraid of thunderstorms and she had stayed with him until dawn, the morning he had surprised her with a handmade card expressing gratitude for her care. Her stories were those of someone who had been present for Michael's daily life and emotional development. David's memories, by contrast, were sparse and focused on formal milestones rather than intimate moments. He could remember Michael's first day at his current school, some birthday celebrations, and a few family vacations, but he realized he had been absent for most of the small moments that actually shape a childhood. Michael listened to both adults with obvious love for each of them, but the asymmetry of their recollections made the difference in their relationships painfully clear. David felt ashamed of how little he had to contribute to this conversation, while Rosa felt awkward about highlighting her own central role in Michael's formative experiences. The evening ended with all three of them feeling emotional but uncertain about how to address the complex feelings that had been stirred up. Michael went to bed earlier than usual, seeming overwhelmed by the weight of the adult emotions he had inadvertently triggered. David and Rosa found themselves in another difficult conversation about their respective places in Michael's life and their family's future. This conversation was different from their previous discussion because David was no longer the distant father who could delegate emotional responsibility to others. He had become genuinely invested in Michael's well-being and happiness, which meant he had to consider how changes in their family dynamic might affect his son. David expressed his genuine gratitude for everything Rosa had done for Michael, acknowledging that she had essentially raised his son during the years when he had been emotionally absent. He also shared his commitment to being present for Michael going forward, and his recognition that this might change Rosa's role in ways that could be difficult for everyone involved. Rosa responded with characteristic grace and wisdom, emphasizing that her primary concern was Michael's happiness and well-being rather than her own position in the family.
She expressed joy at seeing the relationship between father and son finally flourishing, even as she acknowledged her own sadness about the shifting dynamics. But Rosa also made a request that surprised David with its directness and emotional honesty. She asked that any changes to her role in the family be made gradually and with consideration for Michael's feelings, emphasizing that the boy had formed attachments and dependencies that shouldn't be disrupted carelessly. David agreed immediately, recognizing the wisdom in Rosa's approach and her deeper understanding of Michael's emotional needs. They decided to continue with current arrangements while allowing the relationship between David and Michael to develop naturally, making adjustments only as they became necessary, and always with Michael's well-being as the primary consideration. This conversation marked the beginning of a new phase in their family dynamic, one that would be tested by events that none of them could anticipate. Michael's growing maturity and emotional awareness were making him more conscious of the adult relationships that shaped his world, and his own feelings about family, love, and loyalty were becoming increasingly complex. The stage was set for a moment of truth that would require all of them to confront their deepest feelings about love, commitment, and what it means to be a family. Michael's voice, finally heard and understood by his father, would soon express truths that would challenge everyone's assumptions about their relationships and their future together. The late summer heat in Chicago was oppressive, but inside the Chen penthouse, the emotional atmosphere was even more intense as three people navigated relationships that had become more complicated than any of them had expected when this journey began. The autumn air in Chicago carried the promise of change, and nowhere was that change more evident than in the Chen household, where relationships that had seemed stable for years were shifting in ways that demanded a new understanding of love, family, and belonging. Michael was now 9 years old, more articulate in sign language than ever before, and increasingly aware of the complex dynamics between the adults who shaped his world. David had been learning sign language for 8 months, and his conversations with Michael had evolved from simple exchanges about daily activities to deeper discussions about dreams, fears, and the kind of father-son relationship they both wanted to build. Michael treasured these interactions, often seeking out his father for advice about school projects, questions about the business world David inhabited, and philosophical conversations that revealed the boy's growing maturity. But Michael was also becoming more conscious of Rosa's unique position in their family. She remained the person who knew him most intimately, who could read his moods from across a room, and who provided the emotional security that had anchored his childhood. As David became more present and engaged, Michael found himself loving both adults deeply, but in different ways that he was beginning to understand and articulate. The complexity of these relationships became most apparent during family activities that included all three of them. Michael would move seamlessly between conversations with David and Rosa, sharing different aspects of his personality and interests with each adult. With David, he discussed his academic achievements, his career aspirations, and his growing understanding of the adult world. With Rosa, he shared his emotional struggles, his creative projects, and the intimate details of his daily experiences that required patience and understanding to appreciate. David noticed these patterns and felt both gratitude and a lingering sadness about what they revealed. He was building a meaningful relationship with Michael, but he could see that Rosa's connection with his son had a depth and history that his own relationship might never match. Instead of feeling threatened by this reality, David was learning to appreciate it as evidence of the love and care that had sustained Michael during the years when David himself had been absent. Rosa, meanwhile, was navigating her own complex emotions as she watched David and Michael grow closer while maintaining her own deep bond with the boy. She felt genuine joy at seeing father and son finally connecting, but she also experienced moments of melancholy as she recognized that her role as Michael's primary source of emotional support was evolving into something different, though no less important. The situation reached a turning point on a crisp October morning when Michael came downstairs for breakfast with an expression that both adults immediately recognized as serious. He had clearly been thinking about something important, and he approached the kitchen table where David and Rosa were having coffee with the deliberate manner of someone who had rehearsed what he wanted to say. Michael positioned himself where both adults could see him clearly and began signing with unusual formality. He told them that he had been thinking about families and what made them special, about love and how it could exist in different forms, and about how grateful he was to have both of them in his life. His signing was precise and thoughtful, reflecting the careful consideration he had given to these ideas. Then Michael said something that stopped both adults' hearts. Looking directly at Rosa, he signed with unmistakable clarity and conviction, "You are my real mom. You raised me, You learned my language. You stayed with me every day. The words hung in the air like a declaration that changed everything simply by being spoken. Rosa's hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. She had never encouraged Michael to think of her as his mother, had always been careful to speak respectfully of David and to maintain appropriate boundaries about her role in the family. But the truth that Michael had expressed was undeniable. She had been the maternal presence in his life, the one who had nurtured him through childhood and provided the emotional foundation that had allowed him to grow into the thoughtful, confident boy he had become. David felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him, not with anger or jealousy, but with a profound recognition of truths he had been avoiding for years. Michael's words weren't cruel or intended to hurt him. They were simply honest, spoken by a child who had learned to see relationships clearly and express his feelings without the complicated filters that adults often applied to uncomfortable truths. Michael wasn't finished with his declaration. Turning to David, he signed, "You are my father. I love you. You learned my words too, and now we can talk. But Rosa took care of me when I was little. She was my mom when you were working." The boy's ability to hold both truths simultaneously, to love both adults while acknowledging their different roles in his life, demonstrated an emotional maturity that was both impressive and heartbreaking. Rosa's response came through her tears as she gathered Michael into her arms, signing that she loved him more than words could express, but that David was his father and always would be. She tried to explain the complicated adult concepts of roles and relationships, but Michael's understanding seemed to transcend these distinctions in ways that cut straight to emotional truth. David's response surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of defensiveness or hurt, he felt overwhelming gratitude for the clarity that Michael had brought to their situation. He approached Rosa and Michael, joining their embrace and signing his own message of thanks to Rosa for the love she had given his son during the years when he had been too distant to provide it himself. The three of them sat together at the kitchen table as Michael continued to share his thoughts about their family. He signed about understanding that families could be different from what he saw in books or movies, that love could come from people who weren't related by blood, and that the most important thing was how people treated each other rather than what titles they used. Michael's wisdom seemed to come from years of observing the adults around him and trying to make sense of relationships that didn't fit conventional categories. He had concluded that family was defined by care, presence, and love, rather than by biology or legal definitions. His ability to articulate these concepts through sign language gave his words a visual beauty that matched their emotional impact. David found himself asking Michael questions about his childhood memories, wanting to understand how his son had experienced the years when Rosa had been his primary caregiver. Michael shared stories that revealed the depth of their bond, describing how Rosa had comforted him during illness, celebrated his achievements, and provided the consistent presence that had made him feel secure and valued. But Michael also expressed his happiness about his growing relationship with David, signing about how long he had waited to be able to communicate directly with his father and how much their conversations meant to him. He made it clear that his love for Rosa as a mother figure didn't diminish his love for David or his desire to have a close relationship with his father. The conversation continued for over an hour, with all three of them sharing feelings and memories that had previously remained unexpressed. Rosa talked about the joy she had found in caring for Michael and watching him grow, while also acknowledging her awareness that she had filled a role that ideally would have been shared with David from the beginning. David spoke honestly about his regrets regarding the early years of Michael's life and his gratitude for Rosa's presence during that time. He expressed his commitment to being fully present as Michael's father going forward, while also recognizing that Rosa's relationship with Michael was precious and irreplaceable. Michael listened to both adults with the serious attention of someone who understood that important decisions were being made about his future. When they asked him what he wanted their family to look like going forward, his answer was simple but profound.
He wanted everyone to stay together, for Rosa to remain part of their family, and for all of them to continue loving each other in whatever ways felt natural and honest. The immediate aftermath of this conversation brought both relief and uncertainty to the household. The emotional honesty had cleared the air in many ways, but it had also raised practical questions about how their family would function with these truths now openly acknowledged. David and Rosa found themselves having frequent discussions about boundaries, expectations, and how to navigate their respective relationships with Michael in ways that honored everyone's feelings. David made several decisions that reflected his commitment to the new understanding they had reached. He increased Rosa's salary significantly and began contributing to a retirement account for her, recognizing that her years of caring for Michael represented far more than standard housekeeping duties. He also gave her additional time off and encouraged her to pursue her own interests and relationships outside of their family. Most importantly, David began including Rosa in family decisions that affected Michael's welfare and future. He consulted her about educational choices, sought her input on discipline issues, and included her in conversations about Michael's social and emotional development. This collaboration felt natural given her intimate knowledge of Michael's needs and personality. Rosa, for her part, began to relax into her acknowledged role as someone who had maternal significance in Michael's life, while still respecting David's position as Michael's father. She became more comfortable expressing her opinions about Michael's welfare and advocating for his needs when she felt it was necessary. The changes in their family dynamic became most apparent during Michael's 10th birthday celebration, which David planned with significant input from Rosa about what would make the day most meaningful for their son. Instead of an elaborate party with expensive entertainment, they organized a smaller gathering focused on Michael's actual interests and relationships. The celebration included several of Michael's closest friends from school, their families, and a few adults who had been significant in Michael's life, including his sign language teacher and his favorite librarian from the local branch where Rosa had taken him regularly since he was small. The activities centered around Michael's love of astronomy, with a telescope viewing session and a presentation about constellations that Michael had prepared himself. During the birthday dinner, Michael made a toast that moved everyone present to tears. He signed his gratitude for having two parents who loved him, acknowledging both David and Rosa as essential figures in his life.
He expressed appreciation for his father's efforts to learn sign language and become more present, while also celebrating Rosa's years of constant care and support. The other families at the celebration were struck by the obvious love and respect that characterized the relationships between all three family members. Several parents commented to David about how fortunate Michael was to have such devoted adults in his life, and how mature and well-adjusted he seemed compared to many children his age. But the most significant moment of the evening came when Michael presented Rosa with a handmade book he had created about their years together. The book contained photographs, drawings, and written memories of special moments they had shared, from his early childhood through the present. The final page contained a message in both sign language drawings and written English that said, "Thank you for being my mum when I needed one most." Rosa's emotional response to this gift was profound. She held the book against her chest and signed to Michael that it was the most precious thing anyone had ever given her. The exchange was witnessed by everyone at the party, and there was no mistaking the genuine maternal love that Rosa felt for Michael, or the son's love that he felt for her. David watched this interaction with complex emotions. He felt sadness about the years he had missed and the relationship he had failed to build with Michael during his early childhood. But he also felt genuine happiness for both Michael and Rosa, recognizing that their bond was beautiful and life-giving regardless of its unconventional nature. The weeks following Michael's birthday brought a new stability to their family relationships. David continued to deepen his connection with Michael through shared activities and conversations, while Rosa maintained her close bond with the boy without feeling the need to diminish her role or hide her feelings. Michael thrived in this environment of acknowledged love and emotional honesty. The arrangement was tested when David's business required him to travel to Los Angeles for 2 weeks to oversee a major development project. In the past, such trips had been routine, with Rosa managing Michael's care while David focused entirely on work. But now the prospect of leaving felt different to David, and his approach to the trip reflected his changed priorities. David included Michael in discussions about the travel, explaining why the trip was necessary but also expressing his reluctance to be away from home for such an extended period. He asked Michael how he felt about the separation and what they could do to maintain their connection while David was traveling. Michael's response demonstrated his growing maturity and his secure sense of being loved by both adults in his life. He signed that he would miss his father, but that he felt safe and happy with Rosa, and that he understood David's work responsibilities. He suggested that they could video call every evening so that Michael could share his day and practice sign language with his father, even when they were apart. Rosa's reaction to David's changed approach to travel was equally telling. She appreciated being consulted about Michael's care during the trip rather than simply being expected to manage everything independently. She also valued David's obvious reluctance to leave and his commitment to maintaining daily contact with Michael. The 2 weeks of separation became an opportunity for all three of them to appreciate their relationships more deeply. David discovered how much he missed his daily interactions with Michael and how different it felt to be away from home now that he was emotionally connected to his son's daily experience. He found himself thinking about Michael during business meetings and looking forward to their evening video calls more than any other part of his day. Michael handled the separation well, maintaining his school routines and activities while enjoying his time with Rosa. But he also made it clear through their video calls how much he missed his father and how eager he was for David's return. The boy had learned to expect consistent presence from the important adults in his life, and temporary separations had become more meaningful rather than routine. Rosa used the time to reflect on how much their family had changed over the past year and how grateful she felt for the new stability and honesty in their relationships. She had initially feared that David's growing connection with Michael might diminish her own importance in the boy's life, but instead she had discovered that love could expand rather than divide when it was acknowledged and honored. David's return from Los Angeles was celebrated with genuine joy by both Michael and Rosa. The reunion made it clear that their family had evolved into something that worked for all of them, even if it didn't fit conventional definitions of family structure. David had become a present and engaged father, Rosa had been acknowledged as the maternal figure she had always been, and Michael had gained the security of knowing he was deeply loved by both adults. The holiday season brought new opportunities for their family to celebrate their unconventional but loving dynamic. Instead of the formal gatherings that had characterized previous years, they created new traditions that reflected Michael's interests and included Rosa as a full family member rather than an employee who happened to be present. Christmas morning was particularly meaningful, with Michael presenting both David and Rosa with gifts he had chosen carefully to reflect his understanding of their individual personalities and interests. For David, he had selected a book about deaf culture and sign language history, wanting his father to understand the broader community and heritage that Michael was part of. For Rosa, he had created a photo album of their adventures together, including trips to museums, parks, and libraries that had shaped his childhood. The gifts revealed Michael's sophisticated understanding of the adults in his life and his desire to nurture their continued growth and learning. David was moved by his son's thoughtfulness in choosing something that would deepen his understanding of deaf culture, while Rosa treasured the tangible reminder of the countless small moments that had built their relationship over the years. David's gifts to his family members reflected his own evolution as a father and his recognition of Rosa's importance in their lives. For Michael, he had arranged for a private tour of a local observatory, complete with a meeting with an astronomer who could communicate in sign language. For Rosa, he had planned a weekend trip to visit her family in Guatemala, something she had not been able to do in several years due to work obligations and financial constraints. Rosa's reaction to David's gift was overwhelming.
She had not expected such personal consideration from him, and the gesture represented not only his appreciation for her care of Michael, but also his recognition of her as a whole person with her own needs and relationships. The trip would allow her to see her elderly mother and reconnect with siblings she had not visited in years. But perhaps the most significant gift of the holiday season was the decision David announced to his family on New Year's Eve. After months of reflection about his priorities and his commitment to being present in Michael's life, David revealed that he was restructuring his business to allow for more time at home and less travel. The changes would involve delegating more responsibility to his management team, declining certain projects that would require extended travel, and establishing clearer boundaries between work time and family time. David explained that building his relationship with Michael was now his highest priority, and that he was willing to make whatever professional adjustments were necessary to ensure that he could be consistently present in his son's life. Michael's response to this announcement was immediate and joyful. He threw his arms around his father, signing his excitement about having more time together and his appreciation for David's commitment to their relationship. The boy's happiness made it clear how much David's presence meant to him and how secure it made him feel to know that his father was choosing family over business success. Rosa was equally moved by David's decision, recognizing the professional sacrifices it represented and appreciating what it revealed about his transformation as a father. She had watched David evolve from an absent parent who expressed love primarily through financial provision to an engaged father who prioritized emotional connection and daily presence with his son. The new year brought a sense of settled contentment to the Chen household that had been missing during the years of David's emotional absence and the uncertainty of their recent transitions. Michael was thriving academically and socially, secure in his knowledge that both adults in his life loved him deeply and were committed to his well-being. David had found a balance between professional success and personal fulfillment that had eluded him for years. His relationship with Michael continued to deepen as his sign language skills improved and their shared experiences accumulated into a foundation of genuine intimacy and understanding. Rosa had achieved recognition and security for her role in Michael's life, while maintaining the loving relationship that had sustained both of them during the difficult early years. Her position in the family was no longer ambiguous or precarious, but acknowledged and valued by everyone involved. As spring approached and Michael prepared to turn 11, their family faced the future with confidence and optimism that had been built through honest communication, mutual respect, and the recognition that love could take many forms without diminishing its power or importance. The boy who had once lived in relative isolation within his own home now experienced daily connection with two adults who had learned to appreciate both his unique perspective as a deaf child and his individual personality as a thoughtful, creative, and loving young person. Michael's world had expanded not because his deafness had been overcome, but because the adults around him had learned to enter his world and communicate in his language. David had discovered that being a successful father required different skills than being a successful businessman, but that the rewards of emotional connection far exceeded any professional achievement he had ever experienced. His relationship with Michael had taught him about presence, patience, and the profound satisfaction that came from truly understanding another person's inner life. Rosa had found validation for years of love and care that she had provided without expectation of recognition or reward. Her maternal relationship with Michael was now openly acknowledged and celebrated, giving her a sense of family belonging that had been missing from her life since she had left Guatemala years earlier. Their story had evolved from one of missed connections and emotional distance to one of multiple forms of love existing harmoniously within a single family unit. Michael's declaration that Rosa was his mother and David was his father had initially seemed like a crisis that might tear their family apart, but it had instead provided the honesty and clarity needed to build something stronger and more authentic. The lessons learned through their journey extended beyond their individual relationships to broader truths about family, communication, and the nature of love itself. They had discovered that family could be created through choice and commitment rather than biology alone, that communication required effort and investment from all parties involved, and that love was abundant enough to encompass multiple relationships without diminishing any of them. Michael's ability to articulate these truths through sign language had given his insights a visual beauty that matched their emotional depth, creating moments of connection that transcended the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. His journey from isolation to belonging had been facilitated by adults who learned to meet him in his own world rather than expecting him to adapt entirely to theirs. As they looked toward the future, all three family members carried with them the knowledge that they had successfully navigated a transformation that had required courage, honesty, and the willingness to redefine their relationships in ways that honored everyone's needs and feelings. Their unconventional family structure had become a source of strength rather than confusion, proving that love could create its own definitions and boundaries. The house that had once felt too big and cold for a small deaf boy had become a warm home filled with laughter, conversation, and the deep contentment that comes from being truly known and loved by the people who matter most. Michael's silence had been replaced not with sound but with rich communication that connected him intimately to the adults who had committed themselves to understanding and supporting his journey through life. Their story stood as testament to the transformative power of learning another person's language, whether that language consisted of signs and gestures, or simply the willingness to listen with genuine attention and respond with authentic care. David and Rosa had both made the choice to enter Michael's world, and in doing so they had all discovered truths about love, family, and belonging that would guide them through whatever challenges and joys lay ahead. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.